Have you ever wondered about the history we are taught? Whether it is truly the only truthful picture of the past or a tapestry woven from ambition, power, and fear? How many treasures of knowledge have been burned to protect the pride of the victors? How many ancient maps, monuments, and texts have quietly disappeared because they raised inconvenient questions? And if they were all exposed, our entire worldview would be turned upside down. This is not a story about cheap conspiracy theories. This is an exploration of undeniable cover-ups, moments when truth was edited, when our collective memory was redefined to serve a larger order. There is a paradox that few are willing to acknowledge. History is not just about what happened, but also about what people decide is allowed to be told. From the earliest civilizations, power has always come with the privilege of shaping memory. Emperors, churches, dynasties, and empires have not only built monuments to their victories, they have burned down libraries, scratched names from stone tablets, and erased opponents from the records. This is not a random act of forgetting, but a silent, patient project that is more destructive than any weapon. When a civilization collapses, people often remember its crumbling walls and burned temples. But what always burns first is memory itself. A lost manuscript can cut off thousands of years of knowledge. A revised timeline can erase the legacy of an entire people. And a story branded as heretical becomes taboo, existing only as a trembling whisper in the dark. Some scars are too obvious to ignore, like the Library of Alexandria burning in the night, or the archives buried deep in the Vatican catacombs. But there are also more subtle wounds, a research paper that is never published, an ancient map dismissed as science fiction, an archaeological question quietly removed from the curriculum to avoid controversy. And with each such act, the past warps just a little. Gradually, we grow up believing that history is a clear, linear, unchanging, and absolute sequence of events, while the truth is often complex, contradictory, and full of shadows. It is this silence that is most terrifying, because when no one dares to ask what is hidden, the keepers of memory no longer need to burn any books. They can simply wait until the next generation forgets that there was ever a different story. Ask yourself, who holds the pen to write the chronicles that all of humanity is forced to believe? Are you ready? Because once this door opens, you will never look at the past the same way again. When people think of the Library of Alexandria, they often imagine a vast repository of ancient wisdom, a sanctuary containing priceless papyrus scrolls, containing works on astronomy, geography, medicine, philosophy, languages, and distant legends, collected from every corner of the Greek and later Roman empires. Some historians believe that at its peak, the library contained more than 700,000 papyrus scrolls, an astronomical number for any library of the time. But what haunts us today is not just the size of its archives, but the mysterious and tragic way in which it came to an end. The burning of the Library of Alexandria became a symbol of the immeasurable loss to humanity, not just of ink and papyrus, but of all the memories and truths stripped from future generations. According to surviving records, the first destruction occurred around 48 BC, during Julius Caesar's siege of the city. Fires from the harbor spread to nearby warehouses, burning tens of thousands of papyrus scrolls. But that was not the final disaster. Subsequent events, Aurelian's invasion, Theophilus's edicts banning pagan beliefs, and finally the Arab conquest, each wiped out more traces of the library, like waves washing away a shoreline. Many modern scholars, however, argue that these were not mere accidents of war. Some theorize that there was a deliberate effort, a systematic will to eliminate pluralistic knowledge, a kind of knowledge that questioned the divine authority, political permanence, and origin myths of emerging religions. Why, some ask, were so many unique manuscripts from Egypt, Persia, Assyria, and the lands beyond the Mediterranean concentrated in Alexandria? And why did they all disappear at the same time? Was it just a coincidence that toward the end of the Roman Empire, the Christian clergy viewed the preservation of pagan teachings as a threat that had to be eradicated? Some circumstantial evidence. Letters from Alexandrian philosophers and Roman scholars suggests that the papyri may have been smuggled out before the fire to be hidden, but no one knows where they went. Other theories suggest that the most dangerous works, those that challenged religious or political authority, were deliberately destroyed. First, then, the fire was allowed to spread through the rest, erasing the evidence in a final blaze. You can think of the library as a mirror one that reflects the world too clearly, too honestly, for those in power to tolerate its existence. Within its walls are alternative creation myths, non-anthropocentric models of the universe, and records of parallel civilizations that thrived without serving a single authority. If those pieces had existed, the story of humanity might have been told very differently, not as a neat, linear tale of chosen empires, but as a rich, tangled tapestry of ideas and discoveries. Today, all that remains are fragments, scattered references, and anguished letters from scholars lamenting their loss. Centuries have passed, but the debate over what really happened continues to rage. Was it a tragic accident, a stray fire in the chaos of war? Or was it a carefully concealed campaign to wipe out collective memory to make way for a new claim to power? That question lingers, defying any attempt to end it, and it leaves a vast void not just of lost pages, but of the belief that knowledge will survive so long as no one makes it their mission to destroy it. After the tragic story of Alexandria, few people realized that in the same era, in another corner of the Hellenistic world, a second great library arose to rival it, Pergamon. Perched high on a hill in Anatolia, Pergamon was not only the capital of a powerful kingdom, but also a vibrant cultural center where the desire to collect knowledge was pushed to the limit. At its height, the Pergamon library contained more than 200,000 papyrus scrolls, making it the second largest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, second only to Alexandria. Historian Pliny the Elder recorded that the Attalid kings sent agents throughout Greece, Egypt, and Asia Minor to purchase or copy any manuscripts they could find, as if every scrap of knowledge were a prize more precious than gold. That ambition, however, made Pergamon the focus of a quiet but fierce rivalry, what some modern scholars call the Library Wars. According to the geographer Strabo, Ptolemy's Egypt banned the export of papyrus to Pergamon in an effort to hinder its growth. Cut off from traditional writing materials, Pergamon scholars innovated, developing pergamene or parchment made from processed animal skins. In response, Pergamon aggressively pursued rare manuscripts, especially those that Alexandria had not yet acquired. This was not just an academic rivalry, but a soft power struggle. Whoever controlled the largest storehouse of knowledge would have the advantage in shaping intellectual authority throughout the ancient world. But Pergamon's heyday faded as Roman influence crept into Asia Minor. In 133 BC, after the death of King Attalus III, the kingdom of Pergamon was bequeathed to Rome in his will, setting the stage for full annexation. And just before that transfer of power, something strange happened. A large portion of Pergamon's most precious manuscripts disappeared. According to Plutarch's accounts and scattered surviving letters, many of the papyri were removed under cover of night or destroyed outright. The most widely accepted theory is that this was a deliberate purge aimed at denying Rome the use of Pergamon's cultural capital as a tool of control. Others propose that it was Roman emissaries who collected and redistributed the works, sending them to Rome or Alexandria, which was also under Roman influence at the time, to centralize knowledge within the empire's control. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Much of Pergamon's intellectual legacy was never seen again. Catalogues disappeared. The original works of philosophers, historians, physicians, and poets disappeared from Roman records. In the shadow of the power shifts, knowledge became a silent hostage, not only removed from its native community, but absorbed into another archive, where others held absolute authority over what would be preserved, what would rot, and what would be erased from memory altogether. As a modern scholar has observed, if Alexandria is the story of a treasure burned to ashes, Pergamon is the tragedy of a treasure dismantled layer by layer, quietly, systematically, until only the cold stone walls remained as witnesses. And in that silence, it becomes nearly impossible for future generations to distinguish between what was lost naturally over time and what was deliberately erased to monopolize knowledge. If the theories are correct, purging the Pergamon library before handing it over to Rome may have been a strategy to ensure that future generations would never have access to uncensored stories that might have challenged the official history being written. And that leaves us with a troubling question. How many times in history has knowledge been buried not because it was useless, but because it was too dangerous for a new order to tolerate? Pergamon is just one example. But it reminds us that humanity's collective knowledge is more fragile than we think. And sometimes real power lies not in owning information, but in deciding who is allowed to know it. Following the destruction of Greco-Roman learning in Alexandria and Pergamon, our attention turns eastward to another vast and exquisite treasure trove of literature, the early Buddhist manuscripts of ancient India. Beginning in the 3rd century BC, during the Mauryan Empire and the reign of Emperor Ashoka, Buddhist scriptures were compiled and disseminated throughout the Indian subcontinent. Monks, messengers, and scholars carried handwritten texts often inscribed on palm leaves, bark paper, or carved into stone. According to early records, these manuscripts were preserved in major monastic centers, such as Nalanda, Vikramashila, Odantapuri, and numerous smaller establishments throughout India. For centuries, these repositories were believed to contain the most complete and unaltered collections of early Buddhist teachings, including the original sutras and early commentaries that have retained their true semantic depth. Yet most of these manuscripts have disappeared. Scholars argue that this loss cannot be explained by time, climate, or natural decay alone. In the 12th century, India experienced violent upheaval as Muslim Turks and Afghans swept through the region. Monasteries were attacked, libraries burned, monks massacred or forced to flee. In the 13th century, the Persian historian Minhaj-e-Siraj described the destruction of Nalanda not as a massacre, but as a systematic effort to wipe out Buddhist intellectual foundations that were seen as obstacles to Islamization. He wrote that the fires that engulfed the Nalanda library smoldered for 3 months, and even from a distance passers-by could smell the ancient papers burning in the wind. But what has puzzled modern scholars even more is the lack of surviving records of what manuscripts the monks may have discarded before the invasion. Some legends suggest that in an effort to preserve the Dharma, the monks fled east, taking precious scriptures with them into Nepal, Bhutan, and Tibet. Others speculate that a significant number of texts were hidden in remote Himalayan caves, awaiting the right moment to resurface. But centuries have passed, and no reliable evidence has emerged to prove that the original manuscripts were ever recovered. What remains today are mostly later copies that have been heavily edited, translated into Chinese or Tibetan, or reinterpreted through different schools of thought. As a result, scholars can no longer be sure which versions reflect the Buddha's earliest teachings and which have been reshaped over time. Some historians of religion argue that the early loss of Buddhist knowledge was not only the result of war, but also of competing Buddhist schools and shifting political agendas. Each new dynasty had its own reasons for favoring or ignoring particular texts. Philosophical commentaries or critiques that challenged orthodox views were often considered dangerous and potentially divisive, and were deliberately excluded from large-scale copying projects. Over the centuries, the transmission of Buddhist teachings was not a neutral process, but was shaped by the forces of religious, political, and scholarly control. No one can say for sure how much truth was quietly pruned or hidden while remaining on the shelves of the great monasteries. This silent disappearance leaves a profound gap in our understanding of early Buddhism. If the original manuscripts had survived, we might see a very different picture of how Buddhist thought emerged and spread, perhaps a richer diversity of early schools or a deeper connection between Buddhism and pre-Vedic Indian philosophy. Today, archaeologists still uncover the ruins of Nalanda and Vikramashila, the remains of bookcases and foundation blocks that once supported vast libraries. But the most important pieces, the pages, the words, the subtle insights, are gone. Their absence suggests not just neglect, but a strategic erasure of collective memory carried out so quietly that no one has ever named the hand that initiated it. Like Alexandria and Pergamon, the story of India's lost Buddhist manuscripts is not only a tragedy of knowledge destroyed, but also a reminder that the history of ideas is never immune to the touch of power. And in the end, we are left with a single haunting question. Were the scriptures really burned to ashes, or are they still there, slumbering in some hidden mountain recess, waiting for the moment when humanity is brave enough to face the fullness of its own memory? If Alexandria, Pergamon, and the Buddhist monasteries were victims of war and secret campaigns to control knowledge, ancient China witnessed something even more terrifying: a state-sponsored, publicly announced, and historically recorded purge of knowledge, the infamous book burnings, under Emperor Qin Shi Huang. This was not just a symbolic act, but in scope and intent one of the most extreme and methodical attempts to erase collective memory in recorded human history. According to Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian, the edict was issued in 213 BC, shortly after the Qin dynasty had united the disparate warring states into a single empire. The stated goal was to unify the ideology to support the newly established regime, but many scholars today believe it was also a calculated move to eliminate historical reference points and suppress any intellectual challenges to the emperor's legitimacy. The event began with the council of Prime Minister Li Si, a hardline legalist who believed in ruling through strict law and ideological conformity. Li Si feared that Confucian scholars and rival schools were still secretly passing down the history and philosophy of the old states, casting doubt on the legitimacy of the Qin dynasty. The decree required that, with the exception of books on agriculture, medicine, divination, and engineering, all historical records, poetry, and classical texts from the old kingdoms be handed over for destruction. Those found hiding such documents would face severe punishment. Over several months, a huge amount of texts were collected in the capital Xianyang and burned in public bonfires at the imperial court. In those fires, not only were bamboo sticks and papyrus turned to ash, but also hundreds of years of spiritual and intellectual heritage, philosophy of virtue and music, historical chronicles, reflections on morality and human order. All were erased so that history could be rewritten under a single imperial narrative. Some say that the red glow of the burning lit up the horizon that night while scholars watched helplessly, unable to speak out without risking death. A year later, the regime took a second, even darker action: the mass execution of Confucian scholars buried alive as a brutal warning that no dissent against the emperor's authority would be tolerated. However, records from the subsequent Han dynasty, which replaced the Qin, may not be entirely objective. Some modern historians have suggested that the scope of the purge has been exaggerated, perhaps as propaganda to smear Qin Shi Huang and legitimize Han rule. Archaeological finds have confirmed that some texts survived in remote regions hidden by local officials or noble families. Yet even if the extent may be exaggerated, the core truth remains: the Qin dynasty set a dangerous precedent. a centralized power claiming the right to decide what knowledge could be preserved and what knowledge should disappear. What made this event so different from other purgatory of knowledge was its public declaration and straightforward justification. There was no need for war or religion. The regime made it clear that intellectual pluralism was a threat to its authority. From that moment on, an empire that built the Great Wall and designed massive infrastructure projects also sowed the seeds of deep instability, because no order built on forced forgetting can ever truly be stable. Today, as archaeologists examine the ruins sifting through the bamboo sticks that remain, questions remain. How many texts were lost before they could be copied? How much ancient knowledge of astronomy, philosophy, governance, and ethics was burned to the ground? And more deeply, did those fires actually suppress thought? Or did they instead ignite a desire in future generations to recover a stolen memory? The book Burning of Qin stands as one of the clearest examples of a truth that has been repeated over and over again in human history. When power reaches its peak, it seeks not only to rule the land, but also to rule memory and control the very language of truth. And from the ashes of those texts, a question still arises. What else lies buried in the darkness, waiting to be unearthed to reveal the true origins of an empire? After the Xianyang fire burned down the collective memory of ancient China history, witnessed another tragedy, this time across the ocean into the jungles and stone pyramids of the Mayan civilization. Few people realize that Mesoamerica once contained thousands of intricate manuscripts, codexes made of bark paper covered with white lime and engraved with one of the most complex hieroglyphic systems in the ancient Americas. Each codex was not only a religious text, but also contained astronomy, mathematics, calendar systems, and royal chronicles, a vast storehouse of knowledge developed over centuries. And today, we understand only a fraction of what was lost. When Spanish conquistadors arrived on the Yucatan Peninsula in the early 16th century, the fate of this knowledge was sealed. In the name of Christian missionary work and colonial consolidation, Spanish clergy labeled Maya manuscripts as satanic heresies. The most notorious event came in 1562, when Bishop Diego de Landa ordered a mass book burning in the town of Mani. In his own work, Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, Landa describes collecting every Maya codex he could find and burning it in public, believing it to be demonic lies. Hundreds of years of accumulated knowledge preserved in delicate bark scrolls were burned to ashes, while Maya elders and scribes were tortured into revealing their sacred rituals. It is a bitter irony that Diego de Landa, the man who destroyed much of the Mayas' written legacy, also left behind the most detailed account of their writing system, a paradox that continues to fuel debate. It was not until the 20th century that scholars were able to decipher parts of the Maya script. But without the codexes, there simply isn't enough material to fully reconstruct their calendar system or historical records. Of the thousands of manuscripts, only 4 are known to have survived: the Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, and the Grolier Codex. All are now held in Europe, a stark reminder that the knowledge created by the Maya no longer belongs to the descendants of its creators. Some modern historians argue that this destruction was not purely a matter of religious zealotry, but rather part of a deliberate cultural erasure. By forcing indigenous peoples to convert, the colonizers stripped them not only of their gods, but also of their written memory of their origins, their ancestors, and their ownership of their land. In the colonial context, knowledge becomes an instrument of power. Whoever controls history controls identity. The book burnings were then not only symbolic, but also strategic, designed to redefine the identity of an entire civilization. Today, as we walk through the ruins of Palenque Copan or Tikal, we cannot help but wonder how many stories were lost in that fire. Advanced astronomical maps, dynastic epics, recipes for eclipse cycles, agricultural rituals, all turned to smoke. Researchers may never grasp the full depth of Maya thought. Each destroyed codex is a missing piece of an unfinished puzzle. And here is the final paradox. To reconstruct Maya history, scholars have had to rely on the writings of the man who ordered its destruction. For all his prejudices and religious zealotry, Landa left behind a glyph key, the only tool that has allowed the 20th century to begin to decipher this lost world. But the burned pages will never be returned, and no one can say how many secrets remain in the ashes unrecoverable and silent. This story raises a question that has no satisfactory answer. Was the fire at Mani simply the inevitable result of the clash of civilizations and beliefs? Or was it part of a deliberate strategy to ensure that Maya knowledge could never challenge colonial narratives or claim its own place in the world? And if that fire had never been lit, would we see the pre-Columbian history of the Americas with clearer, less distorted eyes? After the fires that burned the Mayan codexes, the story of knowledge lost takes us back west to a text that was once cherished by early Jewish and Christian communities, only to abruptly disappear from the official Bible. This is the story of the Book of Enoch, a manuscript that was both deeply revered and fiercely rejected. According to tradition, Enoch was the seventh patriarch after Adam, a man who walked with God and was taken to heaven without experiencing death. But what makes the Book of Enoch extraordinary is not just its mythological tone, but its cosmological worldview and theological ideas that clashed deeply with the teachings that later dominated organized religion, also known as I Enoch or the Book of Henoch. The text consists of several sections, the most famous being the Book of the Watchful Angels and the Book of the Celestial Bodies. These writings tell of a group of angels, the watchful angels who were sent to earth but fell into temptation teaching humans forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, astronomy, ritual practices, and more. The result, according to the text, was an age of corruption and chaos that culminated in a great flood. These accounts raised troubling questions for religious authorities. If God's plan of salvation was sole and sovereign, how could there be rogue angels acting independently, gifting humans with divine knowledge? And if humanity was punished for acquiring knowledge, where was the line between wisdom and sin? During the first centuries A.D., the Book of Enoch was widely read by early Christian communities and by the Essenes at Qumran. Excerpts were even cited in the New Testament. Jude 1-14 directly quotes a prophecy from Enoch signaling its once prominent status. But by the 4th century, at the councils of Nicaea and Laodicea, the book was removed from the official biblical canon as being of uncertain origin and heretical. From that point on, copying and distributing the text was forbidden. In the Latin and Greek Christian world, it faded into obscurity. Only the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserved it, maintaining the Ge'ez version as part of their biblical tradition. For the rest of Christianity, Enoch became a dangerous apocryphal work surrounded by rumor and theological unease. For more than 1,500 years, European scholars encountered it only through vague references until the 18th century, when Scottish explorer James Bruce brought back several handwritten copies from Ethiopia. The discovery stunned the academic world, providing the first complete look at a text containing complex cosmologies, numerological mysticism, and intricate descriptions of supernatural beings. Some scholars argue that the suppression of the Book of Enoch was not just a theological decision, but part of a broader strategy to control religious knowledge. As the Church sought to define a unified, unshakable doctrine, the text's references to forbidden knowledge or spiritual forces beyond divine control posed a threat. If knowledge could be imparted to humanity outside of God's direct will, the Church's exclusive claim to salvation began to falter. In this light, the Book of Enoch must disappear to prevent opening a door to questions beyond approved theology. Today, as we study the surviving text, we can hear echoes of Babylonian, Egyptian, and pre-Jewish mysticism in it, suggesting that Enoch was a bridge between ancient wisdom traditions long ago severed, and questions remain. How many lost versions of the book ever existed? Did earlier variants explore even more radical ideas about the origins of human knowledge? And most importantly, if the Book of Enoch had never been suppressed, would our understanding of religious history look radically different? The silence that surrounded Enoch until the 18th century is evidence that not all knowledge was lost in the fire. Some was buried in darkness, sealed away by those with the power to define what was considered truth. And in the end, we are left with the unsettling question: how many other pages of knowledge existed only to be quietly discarded so that history could be flattened, simplified, and more manageable? If the disappearance of the Book of Enoch conjures up images of forgotten wisdom buried in silence, the story of the Gnostic texts is far more dramatic, a deliberate and highly organized campaign to erase spiritual knowledge, all in the name of defending the one true faith. Gnosticism, or the Gnostic tradition, flourished in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, as communities from Egypt to Asia Minor began to offer radically different interpretations of the universe, the divine and the human condition, ideas that clashed violently with the emerging orthodoxy of the early Christian Church. For the Gnostics, the material world was not the perfect creation of an all-powerful God, but the flawed construction of a lower being, the demiurge. They believed that the human soul was trapped in the body, and that only through gnosis, mystical hidden knowledge, could it ascend back to a higher divine realm. For the early church, these ideas were not only doctrinally flawed, but also theologically threatening. If salvation could be found within, without the sacraments of the church, the entire institutional foundation of authority would begin to crumble. Gnostic texts circulated in close-knit communities meticulously copied on papyrus scrolls. They recorded mystical dialogues believed by many to be secret teachings given by Jesus to disciples capable of deciphering their deeper meanings. The Gnostic library is vast: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Apocalypse of Adam, and many others. The Gospel of Thomas is particularly controversial because it claims that the kingdom of God resides within each person, without intermediaries. By the late 2nd century, church leaders such as Irenaeus recognized the growing influence of these heretical texts and began a fierce campaign to eradicate them. The Gnostic works were denounced as forgeries designed to mislead the faithful, and anyone found copying or preserving them faced excommunication or even execution. Over the centuries, most manuscripts were systematically destroyed, confiscated in monastery raids, or buried to escape persecution. The campaign was so effective that for more than a millennium, the only knowledge of Gnosticism came from the hostile writings of its enemies. All that changed in 1945, when an Egyptian farmer near the Nile stumbled upon a sealed earthenware jar containing 13 papyrus codexes, now the famous Nag Hammadi Library. Inside were more than 50 Gnostic texts, almost perfectly preserved, containing sayings, revelations, and discourses never before seen by modern scholars. Translated into English and other languages, the texts revealed a rich metaphysical worldview, a universe woven from realms of light, spirits spawning from a divine realm above, and earthly powers, including religious institutions, seen as mechanisms for spiritual imprisonment. For many researchers, the discovery dramatically expanded our understanding of early Christianity, revealing the diversity of voices before a single version of the faith became orthodox. Some scholars warn against romanticizing Gnosticism as entirely innocent or persecuted. Many Gnostic groups were closed-minded, claiming exclusive access to ultimate truth. But one thing is clear. For more than 1,000 years, anyone who copied or preserved Gnostic writings risked death or outright expulsion from the religious world. Today, as the Nag Hammadi texts circulate freely in modern languages, a deeper question arises. Had these texts not been destroyed, would the history of Christianity have emerged as a single thread or as a chorus of competing truths? More profoundly, the Church's willingness to ban dozens of works outright suggests that religious authority is often built not just through preaching, but through guarding memory, deciding what is allowed to exist in the collective mind. The Gnostic story leaves us with a question that resonates through time. Were the scribes hunted down to defend the faith or to protect its power? And if memory can rise from a forgotten earthenware jar, how many other fragments of the past are still waiting to be unearthed, ready to shake the foundations of what we think of as a single history? If the story of the Gnostic texts reveals a deliberate attempt to suppress opposing religious knowledge, the story of the lost writings of Babylon reveals an entirely different dimension, one in which vast stores of ancient knowledge disappeared without a trace, and centuries later an eerie silence surrounded anyone bold enough to ask why. Babylon, the legendary city along the Euphrates River, was once the intellectual crown jewel of Mesopotamia. Its scholars carved thousands of terracotta tablets that preserved knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, law, medicine, and mythology. At the height of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, under Nebuchadnezzar II, the royal library and dozens of temple archives are believed to have contained some of the oldest versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, detailed ritual texts, and lengthy dynastic chronicles stretching back to the Sumerian, Akkadian, and Assyrian eras. When the Persian Empire conquered Babylon in 539 BC, many records were reportedly copied and taken to Persepolis. Later, Alexander the Great's campaigns led to the collection and removal of additional ancient texts, many of which disappeared during the chaotic power struggles of his successors. Yet scholars believe that vast caches of tablets remained intact and untouched for centuries in hidden chambers beneath the ruins. In the 19th century, British and French expeditions began excavating Babylon. But from the start, discrepancies and contradictions arose around what was found and what was reported. Noted archaeologists such as Hormuzd Rassam and Robert Koldewey documented the recovery of thousands of tablets, so many that they could not be catalogued in time. Early reports suggested the discovery of previously unknown chronicles detailing dynasties and events that did not fit into the then accepted narrative of Babylonian and Assyrian history. According to some independent researchers, these inconvenient texts slowly disappeared, either quietly buried in backroom archives at the British Museum, the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, or scattered into private collections never to be fully revealed to the public. Part of the controversy stems from the reluctance of academic institutions to release or even acknowledge certain documents. Many tablets were loosely classified as administrative records or trade accounts without published photographs or transcriptions. Modern Assyriologists often cite a lack of manpower to translate the overwhelming number of tablets. But skeptics ask if these were just ordinary receipts. Why the secrecy? Could some of these tablets contain chronologies, myths, or astronomical records that challenge foundational assumptions about Mesopotamian civilization? The story becomes murkier, with reports of Babylonian tablets appearing at private auctions across Europe and the United States, only to disappear into private vaults. In recent years, some fragments have resurfaced through legal disputes over ownership of the artifacts. Among them are texts revealing unknown rituals and detailed descriptions of comet cycles, descriptions that rival or predate what 19th century Western astronomers believed to be modern discoveries. The paradox is striking in a modern archaeological world that values transparency. Some institutions maintain complete silence about the fate of Babylon's more mysterious works. Scholars have even coined the term academic gray zone, a realm where artifacts exist but remain unnamed, unpublished, and inaccessible. In this zone, speculation thrives, from bureaucratic delays to deliberate suppression, born of fears that certain discoveries might destabilize the historical narrative that modern scholarship has carefully constructed over the past century. Today, as young researchers walk through the ruins of Babylon, they continue to ask, if these ancient records were fully translated and made public, how much of Mesopotamian history and even Near Eastern prehistory would have to be rewritten? And more profoundly, is the long silence surrounding these texts simply a byproduct of chaotic excavation? Or is it silent evidence of a protective effort to preserve familiar frameworks of knowledge by retaining truths that do not fit neatly within them? After the controversy surrounding the lost texts of Babylon and the long silence of academia, our journey leads to another extraordinary discovery. This time not hidden in an ancient royal archive, but buried deep in a dry cave near the shores of the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovered between 1947 and 1956 are widely known for containing the earliest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible and many Jewish texts from the Second Temple period. But among the hundreds of fragile papyrus and parchment fragments, there is one object unlike any other, a unique scroll engraved on metal that has sparked endless speculation and controversy since its discovery. The Copper Scroll. Unlike other scrolls that focus on theology or legal codes, the Copper Scroll is entirely factual. It lists some 60 secret locations, each paired with detailed quantities of gold, silver, and precious objects said to be hidden in caves underground, chambers, and ruins scattered across Jerusalem and the Judean desert. According to the text, the total treasure trove amounts to tens of tons of precious metals, an astonishing amount that has baffled even the most cautious archaeologists. Since its discovery in Cave 3 at Qumran in 1952, the Copper Scroll has undergone a long and difficult deciphering process. Due to severe oxidation, experts were forced to cut the scroll into separate sections just to read the inscriptions. In 1956, Lid researcher Joseph Mielik published the first translation, claiming that it was indeed a literal catalog of hidden treasure. Yet for decades, no official archaeological effort, not by Jordan, Israel, or any international academic organization, has publicly attempted to locate the treasure it describes. Scholars remain divided. Some believe the scroll is symbolic, perhaps a religious metaphor or ritual instruction. Others, including archaeologists such as Vendell Jones, insist that the list is entirely genuine, perhaps detailing treasures hidden by Essenes or rabbinical factions during the Roman siege and destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. Israeli records have hinted at quiet investigations at some of the sites, but their findings have never been fully disclosed. This raises a troubling question. If the Copper Scroll is merely symbolic, why was it engraved in metal, an expensive rare preservation method reserved for texts of immense importance? And if the treasure worth billions of dollars in modern terms is real, what has stopped governments from pursuing it? Some theorize that verifying the scroll's claims could lead to complex religious and legal disputes, particularly regarding the sovereignty of Jerusalem and claims to ancient Jewish heritage. Others propose a more cautious explanation, revealing that the treasure was never found, or worse, long ago discarded, could diminish the scroll's mythical aura, weakening the symbolic power of the entire Dead Sea Scroll collection. And, as history often shows, ambiguity feeds the allure. Today, the original Copper Scroll is housed in the Jordan Museum, while copies, photographs, and translations are on display at institutions around the world. But the sites it describes, from the tomb in the Achor Valley to the cave marked by 2 stone pillars, have yet to be excavated, or at least no verified finds have ever been published. Among archaeologists, many quietly acknowledge that the subject is too sensitive, not just because of the money involved, but because it touches on the theological and historical legitimacy of one of the most hotly contested regions on Earth. The story of the Copper Scroll thus becomes another symbol of how knowledge can be suppressed not by fire, not by censorship, but by a quiet, coordinated silence among those who have the most to lose if the truth is fully revealed. And once again, we are left with a familiar question. Will a forgotten fragment of the past ever rise to break the mist of legend? Or will the truth remain sealed, buried under the thick dust of closed archives? From the mysteries of the Copper Scrolls and untouched treasure sites near the Dead Sea, our story now leads to one of the most hotly debated topics of all time: reports of giant human skeletons being unearthed across the United States only to disappear under mysterious circumstances. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, dozens of newspapers, archaeological journals, and local records reported the astonishing discoveries. Human remains measuring 8 to 10 feet tall, often buried alongside weapons, jewelry, and finely crafted artifacts. Some of the most frequently cited sources include the New York Times, Scientific American, and regional newspapers like the Nevada Tribune. In 1807, a reporter reported the discovery of giant skeletons in a grave in Eureka, Nevada. In 1891, giant bones were said to have been found at the Cahokia Mounds in Illinois. Similar reports emerged throughout the Ohio Valley and the Appalachian foothills, painting a picture of a forgotten race of giants. Complicating the story is the involvement of one of America's most respected scientific institutions, the Smithsonian Institution. By various accounts, Smithsonian representatives were often quick to take custody of the remains for study and preservation. But despite the headlines, none of these skeletons ever appeared in public exhibitions or official reports. Over time, they disappeared, existing only in old newspaper clippings and the oral histories of local communities. This murkiness has fueled countless theories. Many authors have claimed that the Smithsonian, and possibly other federal research entities, deliberately destroyed remains and artifacts because they challenged the bedrock assumptions of modern anthropology, which reject the existence of a parallel race of giants in North American prehistory. In 2014, a newspaper article caused a stir when it claimed that the Smithsonian had been forced to admit to destroying thousands of unusual skeletons. The organization quickly responded, calling the story a complete hoax and adamantly denying the existence of any such records or remains. But skeptics argue that denial is not the same as refutation. They point out that many artifacts have been lost to time in vast, under-resourced museum archives, some uncatalogued, others misorganized. Some independent historians argue that the late 19th and early 20th centuries were formative years for modern evolutionary theory and anthropology. Any discovery that disrupted the emerging plausible picture of human origins was likely to be quietly dismissed, ignored, or dismissed as unreliable. As a result, the image of the giant skeleton became a symbol of that shadowy space where folklore collided with institutional control of knowledge. Among Native American tribes, such as the Iroquois and Choctaw, there were long-standing legends of red-haired giants who once ruled the land before being wiped out. And when reports of large skeletons appeared in the same areas that these legends described, the line between history and collective imagination became harder to draw. Today, mound structures still dot the American Midwest landscape, and local museums occasionally display strange relics, thick bone fragments, oversized tools. But no complete skeleton has ever been independently verified, transparently preserved, or made available for open scholarly review. The absence of this evidence only deepens the intrigue, fueling both suspicion and fascination. And like the Copper Scroll, this mystery leads us back to a familiar question. Is the disappearance of evidence a coincidence, simply a byproduct of early archaeological chaos? Or is it part of a conscious effort to keep human history contained neatly within familiar boundaries? In the quiet spaces between these questions, mounds of grass untouched and unmarked stand like anonymous tombstones daring us to dig deeper, even if we are not yet ready for what we might find.